U.S. stock futures falling this morning as fears mount over growth slowing here, and the president that declined to rule out a recession, that ultimately making some shockwaves here. In an interview with Fox over the weekend, Mike Wilson of Morgan Stanley warning the S&P 500 is due for a 5% drawdown as the tariffs hit earnings and fiscal spending drops. So all of this as we're continuing to monitor some of the moves here pre-market. Joining us now, we've got our own Josh Schafer here. And Josh, what are we making of some of how Morgan Stanley is looking through what the president is and isn't saying and the shock waves that we've seen rippling through the markets?
Yeah, Brett, I think what Wilson's saying there is something you're hearing from a lot of strategists right now, which is essentially we are not adopting our bear case for stocks, but we are getting asked more about it from clients and starting to think more about how stocks could fit our bear case for the S&P 500, right? And I think what's important to understand here is that's counter to what the conversation was over the last 2 years. The last 2 years, all of these strategists we speak with that have S&P 500 targets, it was the opposite story, right? It was, okay, stocks are actually doing better than we thought. What is the likelihood of your bull case? What is the likelihood that stocks actually do better than the S&P 500 target that you set out? Well, when you come into this year, everyone's very bullish on the U.S. economy finally. Everyone's finally positioned for the U.S. economy to grow over 2% for the first time in several years. That was kind of a flip of what we had seen in 2023 and 2024, right? Everyone was more bearish on the economy than it ended up being. This year's been the opposite. So now you're starting to hear people say, okay, how much of a risk do we see to the downside? What I think is important to point out here, and we were pointing this out in the Morning Brief newsletter this morning, when you have these conversations, the word recession comes up, but no one is really calling for a recession right now, at least not the economists and the strategists that we speak with, right? So for instance, if we take Goldman Sachs' probability of a recession in the next 12 months, yes, it recently moved up. It moved up from 15% to 20%. That is not a recession call, right? And I don't think at this point in the market you have necessarily seen an outright recession trade. Yes, you are seeing the market start to price in some of those growth risks because again, it was basically priced for perfection from a growth perspective, but you have not seen a massive equity sell-off that is pointing to a recession at this point. So I think people are trying to understand what would sort of get us there and what that might look like from a positioning standpoint as well.
It sounds like it's less that this is a recession risk trade and more of a momentum unwind that we were already starting to see even before these tariff policies took effect. I know you've spoken with Neil Dutta about his outlook that we were already slowing, and I wonder how CPI might play into that overall narrative as well.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like when we think about the week ahead, Maddie, right, and how much we've been trading off eco data and the volatile swings that we've had, I would project probably an interesting Wednesday morning for CPI, right? And then you also have the producer price index out Thursday. Inflation definitely feels like it's driving the narrative a little bit this week. But to your point, Maddie, it's going to be interesting to watch the market action this week because a lot of the stocks that we've seen fall over the last 2 weeks, if you just looked at the 2025 winners headed into the middle of February, and then you look at what's fallen since, it's Palantir, it's Meta, it's your momentum names that were doing very well. Does that trade now actually start to take out some of the other companies, some of the other members of that 493 that had not necessarily been pure momentum trades? Seems like maybe the next shoe to drop if you're wondering how far the index itself is actually going to fall.
All right. Well, Josh, thanks so much for breaking it down for us and setting us ahead for the week. We appreciate it.